I call the honourable member Shane Ardern.
Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise in support of the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act amendment. Mr Speaker, before I speak, I should do what I always do in these circumstances, and that is declare an interest. I am a shareholder in one of the affected parties in this process. Mr Speaker, before we proceed with why we've got to where we are with the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act at the moment, I think we need to remind ourselves a little bit of the history of how this came about in the first place. And it came about, Mr Speaker, in the first place because two of the largest dairy companies in New Zealand, Kiwi Cooperative Dairies and New Zealand Dairy Group, chose to merge, thereby having a very dominant role or dominant supply of dairy products in New Zealand. And with them, they also merged with the New Zealand Dairy Board, a statutory board at that stage. Hence the birth of the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act 2001. At that point in time, to make that happen or allow that happen, government agreed to give the new entity, Global Co, I think it was called, or New Co-op, which was another name that was used, a dispensation around normal Commerce Commission regulations. And as they say, Mr Speaker, the devil is always in the detail. An agreement was thrashed out that the new co-op would sell or divest up to 52 or 53% of its domestic market products, therefore giving it under 50%. So the nonsensical debate that's going on at the moment, Mr Speaker, about Fonterra's 80% shareholding or 80% ownership of the domestic market is actually factually incorrect and outlawed by this piece of legislation. They cannot own that percentage of the domestic market by law, but no one would let that fact get in the way of the debate. So the big debate around domestic milk at the moment is one that has occupied a fair percentage of media time and people's speculation. And I guess I'm reminded when I see that of the words of Charles Darwin when he said, "It's not the strongest of species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. That is the species that survives." And so Fonterra, in recognition, despite the facts, have come to government and said, we accept that the DIRA legislation should be extended on the basis that the government will hold an appropriate inquiry into who is eligible for this milk. Now, bear in mind, Mr Speaker, what DIRA requires Fonterra to do is make available 50 million litres to any one single entity who is wanting to take advantage of that milk. One of the big debates at the Fonterra farm gate was about the price of that, whether or not the Fonterra shareholder farmer was getting a fair price. And there was arguments on both sides, and the government agreed, the MAF officials agreed, in principle, the current legislation that's being amended by this was unfair. That is, Fonterra shareholders were subsidising that 50 million litres to the competitors that were able to pick it up. The second and most important issue in that debate, Mr Speaker, was that Fonterra's farm gate price, I guess, is as transparent as any price you can get. It's advertised in the paper. People know what it is. And just by the way, as an aside, as a farmer, the average price per litre of milk to my farm in the last 10 years has ranged between 35 cents a litre and this year potentially 79 cents a litre. So 35 cents a litre to 79. Nothing hidden about that. Everyone knows it. It's published. It's in the paper. It's there for anyone to see. So the Commerce Commission inquiry that was spoken of by the previous speaker will be an interesting inquiry, because clearly the difference between the 79 cents that the farmer gets paid at the farm gate and what Mum of Glenfield is paying in the supermarket is substantially different. And where that difference is, it would be interesting to find out. So that said, it was decided that regulation should be passed, that a piece of legislation, this amendment, should be passed to improve the farm gate price, that is the price that Fonterra gets paid for the 50 million litres it must by law make available to its competitors, and the setting for that was farm gate price plus 10 cents a kilogram to take into account shoulder milk. which I won't explain now, Mr Speaker, because it's a bit difficult for people to understand in the time I've got. So, farmgate price plus 10 cents. So not hard for anybody to work that out. In the process of submissions, Westland, a company who chose in the initial merger of the major companies to stay outside of the new Fonterra or Global Co structure, said in its submission that the correct status for compulsory supply of raw milk is to distinguish between raw milk for domestic retail purposes and industrial product for export. Regulated raw milk supply is appropriate for protection of domestic customers, but not to artificially support industrial ingredient producers. Westland believes that manufacturers of dairy products for export are competing for an international market share and should not have access to dairy milk. Now, that is one of the small companies, Mr Speaker, and that is what they said, and I happen to agree with them. The original principle was that a small amount, 50 million litres of milk, and a total amalgam of that of up to 600 million litres of milk should be made available by the big new co-op to small start-up companies who were going to deliver products into the domestic market. What we've got is we've got some large multinationals using their muscle to invest in small processors and gaining access to this milk. And so that was never the intent of the original legislation, and the new or review that is about to take place, Minister announced would take place in March, which is now ongoing, should bring some clarity to that and hopefully some further transparency to how that process works. And finally, Mr Speaker, I must say that this industry collectively is 27% of this country's export earnings. It is our single biggest industry. It is the industry that will help this government and successive governments into the future pay for the social services that this country so badly requires and desires. And, Mr Speaker, it's probably the least interesting debate in terms of what people pay attention to in this Parliament. So you've got an industry that is one of the largest, if not the largest single industry in the country, and it is the one that gets the least attention in terms of some of the detail. And I always have found that quite amazing. So that said, Mr Speaker, we're supporting the passage of this bill. We look forward to the review that has been announced and the findings of that review. The submission process was one that was thoroughly gone through, and the end result, I'm sure, will be one to the satisfaction of all those involved. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker.